You know, I didn't know that we could tell Mouzon Biggs hair stories tonight. Oh, okay, I'm getting a sign down there. If we could do that, I had a different direction I was going to go with this talk. I remember the day we jumped over in canoes in the creek down in Beaumont, but I won't talk about that tonight. You know, it was a little over 2 years ago that I had the incredible privilege to come and be a part of the Barton, Clinton, Gordy lectures here at Boston Avenue. It was truly an honor that I will always appreciate so much. To come and to be with my mentor and friend and to be with Gail, to come and get to be in this incredible church, to be able to preach on a Sunday morning and a Sunday evening and a Monday night. And I remember we came in early on Sunday morning and Mouzon and I were standing right back here at the back. And we were gathering, kind of getting ready for service, and as we were standing back there, he was saying, you know, Bob, I got to get my knee operated on. It's not working so well anymore. I'm going to have to get it operated on. And I said, well, let me tell you, Biggs, I just had mine done. I can tell you about that knee, what to expect. And we were back there kind of talking about our aches and pains. But I started thinking about how he was 70 years old. And I knew he had to retire in 2 years. And while we were standing back there talking about all this, I kind of had a flash before my eyes, and I was 13 years old, sitting on the front pew at First Methodist Church in Houston. And thinking about when I first had met him, and now here he was the pastor of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church, about to retire. I was the pastor of St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Oklahoma City. And I suddenly turned to him and said, where did it go? Where did it go? 13 years old. 46 years ago, I was sitting on the front pew at First Methodist Church. Marcia, my wife, she was also there in the youth group. We were together. It was so very exciting when First Methodist got a new pastor, Mouzon Biggs, Gail. And we would watch the family kind of come along and grow. There'd be Trey and then Allison and Jason. What a privilege it was. But they came, and the church was so excited about it. Mouzon had been serving at Memorial Drive United Methodist Church. You've heard the stories through the years. But that was a great church. When he got out of seminary, he came there. They put him in charge of evangelism, and he just excelled. They were taking in so many members out there at Memorial Drive. Charles Allen said, I want him working for me. And went out and recruited Mouzon to come to First Methodist Church with a great promise, I'll let you preach the Sunday evening service. Now, the Sunday evening service going on at First Methodist Church was no great plum. We were a downtown church. The Sunday evening, we were running somewhere around 90 to 95 on Sunday night on a huge sanctuary. We like to say it was comfortable. That meant there was enough room for everyone to lay down, and there was enough room. But he went ahead and came to First Methodist Church and took that Sunday evening service when I was starting MYF, Methodist Youth Fellowship, and you came to MYF, and then you came to worship, and if you came to worship, then you got to go to After Church Fellowship, ACF, and you didn't want to miss the party, so you always came to worship. But I got to where I didn't want to miss worship. This new guy, when he came, man, he could preach. He knew how to tell a story. We all started coming. He'd be at First Methodist Church 7 years. As I said, when he came, we were running 90 to 95 on Sunday evening. When he left, we were averaging more than 800 on Sunday evening in a downtown church. It was incredible. It had not happened before, and I'm sorry to say it has not happened since. It was a moment in history. We came, we were inspired. They had an incredible altar, and we ended every service being given the opportunity to come and to kneel and to pray. Some of the most meaningful moments of my life were coming to that altar and praying on Sunday night right there at First Methodist Church as a boy growing up. I'd always said that I was going to be a Methodist minister. I knew I was going to do it all my life. And so I made sure on Sunday evenings when we got through with the services, I'd hang around just so I could talk a little bit with Mouzon. I just wanted to be able to talk, and we'd share and hear. And why he chose to give me time, I have no idea. But it changed my life. We would visit. And then when I got to be a senior in high school, he started inviting me to come to his study, and I would come up there to his office. We would visit, and he'd talk about, here's how you do it as a Methodist minister. You need to take a small country church while you're in seminary. He started telling me all these kind of things, and whatever he said, I agreed. And so I got all signed up and got my license to preach. In those days, it wasn't as challenging as it is today. In those days, if you wanted to have a license to preach, they called you into a room, and then they held up a mirror and said, breathe. I got my license to preach, and I got sent out there to 3 little country churches. I'd preach at Richards, Bays Chapel, and Stoneham, and at the end of a whole day, I hadn't seen 100 people. But Mouzon told me this is what I needed to do, and so I was there. And it wasn't long I had my first funeral, and I did not know what to do, but I would call, and he would answer and say, you stand here with the casket, you lead here to the graveside, you do it. He was there to help me. I called and said, would you and Gail come up to Richards? Would you come and preach on a Sunday night? And they drove up on a Sunday evening and came up, and here he preached, and it was an incredible experience. No, he was so much there for me to be helping. I graduated. I went on to seminary. It turned out that I was the last wedding. Marsh and I got married at First Methodist Church, and Mouzon did our wedding, and it was the last wedding he did at First Methodist Church before he was appointed to Trinity United Methodist Church in Beaumont. And so it was when I got into seminary, I had to do an internship, and I had already said, I want to come be your intern. And so we worked it all out, and we went down to Beaumont, and what a great time we had with Mouzon and Gail for that year. I learned so many important things that year. When I first got there, Mouzon said, I think you have the ability to preach without notes. You could do this. I'm telling you, I was told this years ago, you could do this. And I'd always been preaching with notes now for these last about 4 years, and I said, man, to preach without notes, I mean, what happens if you forget what you're preaching? And I will never forget those words of wisdom when he said, we go home early. Okay. I decided to try, and I hate to tell you this, but no one has gone home early in all these years. I got to preach on television there at Trinity. When he came to Trinity, again, Trinity was not some great church. It was a good church, but Trinity had seen some very difficult days. Mouzon came. He got that church on television down in Beaumont with good hair and a stem and stick pin. He was ready. And Trinity went from a church that was doing this to where Trinity was doing that. It became the finest church in that part of our state. It was amazing what was happening down at Trinity. He was on television doing devotionals. He was out in the community with Rotary. People knew about Trinity United Methodist Church because of what Mouzon was doing. I got to come and be able to preach on TV. And I'll never forget, when I came and preached here at Boston Avenue, it's different from St. Luke's. We're a week delay. I can preach as long as I want, and they edit me down to fit the time that we have. Here, you don't know when you're going to get up. And when you get up, you know when you're going to come off. There is a clock running back here, and they tell you, regardless of when you get up, you got to get off at a certain time. It was that way at Trinity there in Beaumont. And when I had my first opportunity on a Sunday morning, I said, Mouzon, what do I do? And he said, oh, it's not a big deal. If you could come off somewhere around, 11:58 and a half to 11:58, that'd be good. Okay. He said, you got a clock right down here. You're watching it. It's really better if you're going to err one way or the other, come off a little early, because then you can do something very biblical. I said, what's that? And he said, watch and pray. Just start praying, watch the hand go by, and you know when to say amen. I learned incredibly valuable lessons while I was there at Trinity. Mouzon was speaking all across the country, but so much in our area, Texas and in Oklahoma and around, and he would go on these speaking engagements. And he was so gracious to me. He invited me to go with him, and we might ride 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, and the whole time we would talk. We'd talk about church politics. We'd talk about how to run a church. We'd talk about what was going on. Just to have that kind of private time, us driving, was so invaluable and so incredible. I got to tell you, you may not know this, but Mouzon likes to drive fast. He drives fast. Now, he has a little more sedate-looking car today, but when we were in Beaumont, he had a Formula 400 Firebird. It was bright orange. And I tell you, when we would ride to these speaking experiences, it was a religious experience. Quite often I heard myself hollering to myself, "Oh, Jesus, oh, Jesus." This man loved to drive, and we got there, but we had a good time. He had 3 or 4 speeches that he would give, and it was, he'd choose, and I'd say, "Which one is it tonight?" And he'd tell me, and he'd give it. And, after I'd done this for close to a year, I said, if you forget food poisoning at the banquet, I can stand up and give this. I got your speech down, man. I can do this. It was such a blessing as we learned and did so much together. I went back to seminary, and when I was going to get out of seminary, my dream was to come back to Beaumont and be his associate pastor. Timing did not work out. That was not an option. But the truth of the matter is, after 6 years and serving little country churches and the time I'd spent with him, I was ready. I got the opportunity to go to start a new church right out of seminary there in Houston, and same as always, anytime I had a question, he was anxious to help. But I didn't need it as much. When I went out to start this new church, it was Finus Crutchfield who was my bishop. And Finus Crutchfield called me in and he said, "Bob, I got an opportunity for you out here in southwest Houston. You need to know we don't have any land, we don't have a building, we don't have a congregation, we don't know anybody's interested, but it's a lot of potential out there. So good luck, God bless. When you have a church, come back and let us know." When I went out there and I was confronted with so many decisions, I always had 2 questions I asked myself. And I mean this. I always went out there, 2 questions I asked myself. Having to decide, I'd say, what would Jesus do? And secondly, I said, and what would Mouzon do? The first I wasn't always sure about. The second I always knew. And it made all the difference in the world. All the difference in the world. Now, I got to tell you, what Mouzon did for me was not unique. He did it for so many. It made all the difference in my life. I know that I am where I am today because he blessed my life. But he didn't just do it for me. I started thinking about all the people who've come through this church, people who've been interns and associate pastors. I started talking to some of them, to Sam Powers, who grew up at this church. And Sam was telling me, growing up in Boston Avenue, I'll never forget, I was in youth group, and Mouzon came and started talking about source theory with us and explaining the Bible. And he goes, "I'd never heard such a thing, but to think he thought we were smart enough for this." He said, "It changed my life." He's now the senior pastor at First Methodist Church in Piedmont, a great church. I was talking with Amy Venable, and Amy was telling me how, I appreciated Mouzon tried to teach us that you can use your brain and your faith. They should be compatible. That it's okay to think. He taught that to me. He taught that to David. He taught it to us all. It's okay to think, to use your brain and with your faith. I look at Amy, and she's now at St. Stephen's in Norman, having just won the Harry Denman Award for Evangelism at our annual conference. I started thinking about Kevin Tully, intern, associate pastor, now we're at First Methodist Church in Bartlesville. They're in a multi-million-dollar campaign to build a new sanctuary. Thought about Kent Ingram. Kent, who came and was an intern and associate pastor, and I see Kent at least once a year when we get together here in Tulsa for the large churches, and he and I talk far more often than that, but Kent is at First Methodist Church in Colorado Springs, one of the best, if not the best, Methodist church in the Rocky Mountain Conference. Now David Wiggs, who left from here. He went to First Methodist Church in Enid after having been on staff for 13 years here. And I loved it. In talking to David, I said, "What did you get out of being at Boston Avenue?" And he said, "I watched how Mouzon did stewardship. I watched how he did sermons. I watched how he was leading staff. I was always trying to learn. And when First Methodist Church in Enid came open and he went there, he said, I got there and they'd ask me questions and I knew I'd do this, I'd do that. He said, they thought I was a genius." He said, "I was just telling them what I'd learned at Boston Avenue." the fact that I got to go to St. Luke's, I've always felt a little sense of pride, I got to be honest, that knowing you were on ABC covering the eastern half of the state and I was on ABC covering the western half of the state. But when you stop and think about the churches that pastors pastor right now, who you have blessed their lives, First Methodist in Piedmont, St. Stephen's, First Bartlesville, First Colorado Springs, Boston Avenue, St. Luke's, that's incredible. It truly, truly is incredible. And we are only some of those. Where did it all go? 46 years ago. Time stops for no one. For 54 years, you have done your best to share the gospel and to bless life. And so for all of those, I have the privilege tonight of saying thank you.